You may not be able to tell, but Final Fantasy is pretty much my favorite video game franchise. Blech. I fell in love with these games in the early 90s, and even though it's no longer the RPG behemoth that it was then, I still love these games. One question that gets asked a lot by newcomers to the series is, where do I start? It's a good question, but one that's tough to answer. There really isn't a right answer. Pick almost any Final Fantasy game, and someone somewhere started with it and loved every minute of it. That said, some games in the series are just better than others. Ugh. Ugh. Ah. Here are the 3 games that I think best encompass what the Final Fantasy franchise has to offer. This list is only going to include mainline titles, so you don't have to worry about seeing that Final Fantasy game. We can pretend it doesn't exist. For now. Number 3. Final Fantasy I. I've always been a sucker for wanting to start a series from the beginning, even if none of the games are connected. That aside, I still believe Final Fantasy I makes for a good starting point for people interested in seeing what the series is about. I wouldn't recommend the NES original, as later versions added quality of life features and, more importantly, fixed a ton of bugs. The PlayStation 1 port is the closest to the original experience, but fixes the bugs and adds a run button. The GBA, PSP, and mobile versions ditch the level-based spellcasting in favor of a set MP pool more in line with later Final Fantasy games. So what makes this game a good point of entry for the series other than it being the first game? For one, it introduces you to a lot of themes that come up in later Final Fantasy games. Crystals representing 4 elements, airships, and iconic jobs like black mages. It's also a very typical JRPG, but I mean that as a good thing. Battles are completely turn-based, you earn experience and gold as you defeat monsters, and you'll level up and become stronger. The game is also relatively short, clocking in at around 20 hours. Many other games in the series can easily take you over the 40-hour mark, so this is a great way to get your feet wet without a huge time commitment. While the game can be a bit unforgiving at times with its instant death attacks, it's also not particularly hard either. As long as you use the tools at your disposal wisely and don't run from every single battle, you'll be able to make it through without too much frustration or extra grinding. And yes, there is some grinding involved, although after my most recent playthrough, I have to say it's not anywhere near as bad as I used to remember. My last point is much more subjective, but I love the idea of starting with a blank slate party. Not only can I make them whatever jobs I want at the start of the game, but I also get to name them. There's something I've always found exciting about the idea of putting me and my friends in a game and going on an adventure together. It provides a sense of attachment and personality for your characters that you might not otherwise get. If you want a classic RPG experience that can be finished over a long weekend, you could do much worse than Final Fantasy I. Number 2. Final Fantasy IX. Final Fantasy IX is one of the most beloved entries in the franchise for a reason, and the reason for that is also what makes it a great starting point for series newcomers. Final Fantasy IX is essentially a love letter to what came before it, particularly Final Fantasies 1 through 3. There are numerous references to these older titles, and while it is neat when you catch one like Doga's Artifact or Un's Mirror, you aren't going to be lost as to what's going on in the story without that prior knowledge. Final Fantasy IX also represents a return to a more high fantasy setting after the more technologically advanced settings that were in Final Fantasy 7 and 8. Final Fantasy IX also plays very similarly to many earlier Final Fantasy games, largely due to the ATB battle system that was in place from Final Fantasy IV all the way until Final Fantasy X. With this battle system, each character has a bar that fills up during battle based on their speed stat. When that bar is filled, the character is able to take an action in battle. This makes battles feel more engaging as you're rewarded for quick thinking, and it keeps you focused during battles. Some of the spell and ability animations are a bit long and can feel like they slow down battles, but overall I think this system works really well. If you can get on board with this battle system, you'll be in good shape for Final Fantasy IV through 8. Another reason this is a great starting point are the character jobs. Unlike Final Fantasy I, you won't be able to pick specific jobs for your characters, but each one more or less has a job that's found in other Final Fantasies. There's Vivi, the iconic Black Mage, Freya the Dragoon, and Eiko the Summoner. This helps establish some familiarity with the abilities you'll be seeing in other Final Fantasy games. Freya's jump ability is seen in Final Fantasy 3 through 7, summoning shows up in some form in every Final Fantasy game starting with Final Fantasy 3, and using enemy skills, or blue magic, appears in many Final Fantasy games starting with 5. The plot may be the most quintessential example of Final Fantasy storytelling. I wouldn't say it's the best story in the franchise, but it is the most representative of what Final Fantasy stories have to offer. I don't want to spoil the plot, but there's betrayal, romance, character development, and a plot that gets weirder as time goes on. Depending on how much exploring you want to do, expect to spend around 40 to 60 hours completing this one your first time through. This might be a big ask for someone just starting out with the franchise, but if you're the type that enjoys longer games, Final Fantasy IX makes for an amazing experience. Number 1, Final Fantasy IV. Coming in at number 1 is Final Fantasy IV. Pretty much everything I said about Final Fantasy IX applies here. Final Fantasy IV offers little bits of what almost every other Final Fantasy has to offer. As I mentioned earlier, the ATB combat system is introduced in Final Fantasy IV and is used all the way until Final Fantasy X. Much like Final Fantasy IX, the characters all have jobs. Kain is a Dragoon, Rosa is a White Mage, and Edward is useless. I mean a bard. Wait, no, I was right the first time. Seriously, even the little girl with the stick hits harder than he does. This will help you familiarize yourself with the classes you'll see in other Final Fantasy games. The only downside is that not every version of the game allows you to choose your endgame party, so you might not have as much control over your team's makeup as you would like. Also similar to Final Fantasy IX, the story contains a lot of the elements we associate with the Final Fantasy series, namely themes around love and loss, protecting the crystals of the elements, and plot twist after plot twist. One of the things that makes this a great point of entry for the series is that you can almost choose your own difficulty depending on which version of the game you play. The SNES version is pretty easy and might not be too bad for RPG newbies. For people familiar with RPGs but maybe don't have a lot of experience or just like to play games for the story, the PSP version is a very solid port and my personal favorite. It reintroduces a lot of skills that were removed from the initial SNES release, and it also allows you to pick your party towards the end of the game, so it offers some variety not found elsewhere. For anyone looking for a decent challenge, try the Steam or mobile ports, though if you're playing on Steam, I'd recommend an FPS patch to smooth out the frame rate a bit. So if you were worried that your first Final Fantasy game might be too hard or too easy, Final Fantasy IV has you covered. I'm not sure how to make my last point without sounding insulting towards this game, so I'm just gonna say it. Final Fantasy gets better from here. I'm sure someone will disagree, but I don't personally know anybody who says that the series peaked with Final Fantasy IV. That's not to take anything away from this game because it was amazing for its time and it still holds up pretty well today. It's a strong showing and I think it's good to know that Final Fantasy gets even better from here. So there you have it. That's my list of the top 3 games to start your Final Fantasy journey with. Any list on the subject is going to be at least a bit subjective. My first and favorite Final Fantasy didn't even make the list. There's not really a wrong answer. I know plenty of people who started with Final Fantasy VIII, but I wouldn't say it's the best to start with. I'm actually not gonna throw this one because it's my wife's. Just set that down. That said, I think the 3 games I went over today are the best representations of what Final Fantasy has to offer. If you're a longtime fan of the series, I'd be interested to hear which Final Fantasy games you think are the best to start with. I'd also be curious to know which one you started with personally. If you're new to the series, I'd love to know which game we talked about today appealed to you the most. If you enjoyed the video, consider giving it a like and subscribing to the channel, as those things really help me out. If you want to hear more about Final Fantasy IX, consider checking out the Final Fantasy IX episode of the Legend of Retro podcast, where my good friends at Gamezilla Media go a bit more in depth about the game. Link to that in the description below. As always, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.